the question that I want to ask you is whether or not, and I think this was maybe what you're getting at in that last quote from Darwin, is whether or not we're treating the animals with too little respect and appreciation. A couple of years ago, Dan Messé and I, who's helping me run this conference, went and gathered a collection of metaphors that we use to talk about animals. This was inspired by a comment that Mary Midgley made to me when I was at Oxford about how when we talk about animals, that it's almost always negative. And so Dan and I, mostly Dan, gathered sort of randomly metaphors that talk about animals. And it turns out that they're mostly negative. Things like this idea is for the birds, Tom Ward is a stool pigeon, Greg Boyd has ants in his pants, the cat has your tongue, you're the underdog, go A, pig out, and so on. For every negative image like that, for every positive image, there's 2 or 3 negative images. So in our sort of natural rhetorical approach to the world, we somehow find it easy to come up with negative metaphors about animals. And there are a few positive ones. We can be free as a bird or happy as a lark and so on. I mean, we do have those, but they're rare. Now, when we look at recent primate studies, now I'm struck by how extraordinarily human the primate seem. So the question that I want to ask you specifically is whether or not we're going to have to kind of modify the theology of the image of God being implanted in humans and somehow come up with something that reaches down into natural history a little bit. But let me give one example that comes from Frans de Waal. Frans de Waal, who is one of the world's leading primatologists, has endless stories that he can tell now because he has watched primates in natural settings for hundreds and hundreds of hours and has observed their many behaviors. And he has anecdotes that are very, very provocative. One of these anecdotes concerns a bonobo named Cooney. And Cooney witnessed a starling strike the side of a building and fall down stunned onto the ground. Cooney went over to the starling, picked it up very, very carefully, lifted it into the air, and released it. And it fell down onto the ground again. Cooney picked it up a second time and released it. It fell down to the ground. So Cooney painstakingly climbed to the top of a tall tree and hung carefully on the tree with his feet and stretched out as far as he could and released the bird into the air, hoping that it might be able to fly away. It fluttered a bit and came back down without injury to the earth. And then Cooney came back down and hovered over the bird for the rest of the day, keeping other bonobos at bay until the bird recovered and then flew off on its own. Now, this is a very provocative story. I do a lot of work in a sunroom that occasionally has birds come crashing into the window and land on the deck beside me. And I'm embarrassed to say, sometimes I just say, bummer, that must have been. If I would allow myself to be inspired by Cooney, I might go out and rescue that bird. Now, we have a story that we're all very familiar with called the Good Samaritan. That's something like that. And is it time to ask the question, not who is my neighbor, but who is my species? And perhaps we should be able to reach beyond the human species as we think theologically about creation. So that's the loaded question I want to give you. And basically the question is, as someone who studied this a lot, what is your analysis of how human-like these characteristics are, and can we talk with moral language and so on about these primates? Okay, so those are the questions. If you guys would come up and quickly dispose of those 2 trivial initial questions, and we'll take some more from the audience.
My short answer to your very insightful question is yes. These questions are insoluble. The question of, is there purpose? How would we establish that? The evidence is ambiguous. We have, on the one hand, this beautiful and complex reality, but it is also full of horror and discord. How do we find an answer to that question? And why is there so much suffering and evil in the world created by a good and all-powerful God? I would just have to maintain that if you have easy answers for these questions, that you have not understood the questions. But having said that, I think there are more and less helpful ways of approaching the questions. For example, the stronger your doctrine of divine determination of what there is in world process, that meticulous providence that determines everything that will come to be or happen, the more exaggerated the problem of evil comes to be. These two questions, central questions of meaning and purpose and the problem of evil, are in a sense correlated. And I think it's important how we answer these. It's important how we respond to them. I don't think it would be sufficient just to throw up our hands and say mystery, though I think that's the final word at the end of the day. But we called upon to love God with our minds as well as our hearts. I think we inquire into these things and we struggle with them and we face the complexity of them. And we begin theologically to work with themes that are helpful and redemptive, to talk about freedom in world process, to talk about divine compassion in the face of evil and suffering, and to talk about human responsibility to be in solidarity and resistance in the face of evil.
I'm trying to reflect on the interesting series of questions and observations that Carl gave me. And the last part about the bird and his touching confession that he does not always care for birds that will fly into these windows. I can go further because I saw him at dinner tonight. He ate a bird. so did I, for what it was worth. I agree with you that for many Americans, the notion that we are animals or connected to the animal kingdom in terms of ancestry is profoundly unsettling. And I told the group this morning this. I was at a hearing in front of the Texas State Board of Education concerning textbooks. And at one point, one of the commissioners said, I resent the fact that in your classification of living things, you gave an example of a member of each living kingdom, and the example you gave the animal kingdom was a human being. And I resent you telling me that I'm an animal. And, I was, as I explained to the group this morning, it was Friday, it was late, and I was in full wise guy mode. And I said, well, sir, I have 4 other kingdoms available. If you want me to put you in with the fungi, I'd be happy to do that. But I also said, as for myself, I'm very proud of being in the animal kingdom, and I'm happy to stay there. And the fact of the matter is that we are animals. And even Linnaeus, who was a creationist, who was the father of modern taxonomic classification, immediately classified us not just as an animal, but also as a primate. It's very clear from our physiology. And not even Ken Ham would disagree with the fact that we are animals and that we are classified among the primates, among the mammals. So that's very clear. Why is that so profoundly unsettling? Well, I think the metaphors that you brought up are actually one of the reasons why it is so profoundly unsettling. And many people actually, when they talk about animals, it's those darn monkeys that they don't want to be related to. And I'll tell you my story. I've been fortunate in my time of teaching to have had a number of absolutely wonderful students who I've taught in the classroom and have worked with me in my laboratory and done research. And one of the best is a wonderful young woman, she's not young anymore, named Lucy Spellman, who worked in my lab for 2 years, did an honors thesis with me. Lucy and I are actually co-authors of 2 papers based on her undergraduate work in the American Journal of Pathology. Lucy went on to veterinary school at University of California, Irvine, and then I lost track of her. And I was listening to National Public Radio 4 or 5 years ago, and I heard an interview. The voice was really familiar, and I couldn't place it. And at the end of the interviewer said that was the voice of Dr. Lucy Spellman, the director of the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. So Lucy, my former student, had become director of the National Zoo. She's not there anymore, but she was there for several years.